My guest for this episode is David Matsumoto, and for anyone more than just superficially interested in deception detection, this interview will be a real treat. While Paul Ekman has come to popular fame through the television series Lie to Me, which introduced the concept of micro-expressions to the general public, his collaborator from the early years, David Matsumoto, has quietly perfected this methodology. But David is not only a scientist who has spent his career investigating emotions and their correlations with nonverbal behavior, he has also focused his research on deception detection. This makes David a true expert in this field, also he's far too modest to ever claim a title such as this. Via his company Humintell, he trains law enforcement and negotiators around the world in reading people, but the foundation of his training courses is empirically validated research. For me, this interview was especially interesting because we covered a distinct type of deception, acts of omission, which were at the center of my own academic research. Contrary to what a million books seem to claim, people don't really like to lie, at least not outright, and especially not in situations where it really matters. Instead, liars tend to circumvent tricky situations by omitting, that is, by skipping over relevant information, and this is true for the home front, in business, especially in negotiations, and in politics. There are many advantages for this strategy, but that's a discussion for another day. This being said, true lies, such as complete or partial fabrications, also known as acts of commission, do exist, and it becomes ever more important for a lucid society to have the skill set required to counter the ever more sophisticated manipulations from governments and special interest groups that penetrate our subconscious mind unfiltered via the echo chambers on social media. Reading people is not only a learnable skill, it is also a journey, but probably a bit longer one. There are no shortcuts and no magic bullets, and there are no surefire signs that could tell you if someone is lying. I really had to bring it to you, but Pinocchio's nose does not exist. If someone is claiming that this one book or this special offer online course will make you a nonverbal communication expert and lie detector, well, this someone is probably lying. What you can do instead is to listen to podcasts such as this one, where true subject matter experts share what they have learned based on empirical, peer-reviewed evidence, so that you can make up your mind based on facts and not on myths, no matter how widespread or accepted they are. If this appeals to you, feel free to join me on my journey. Hey David, really appreciate that you found the time for this little conversation of ours. I came initially across your name in the context of microexpression, which we will discuss a little bit later. Yeah? But first, to introduce yourself from the massive amount of information that I have found on the internet about you. Yeah? You're a psychologist, you hold a PhD, you have taught or you're still teaching on the San Francisco State University, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
You are an extremely prolific writer. You have over 400 articles and if I counted them correctly, I believe more than 17 books in multiple languages.
Let me just correct that. It's not 400 articles, it's 400 works in total.
Okay.
It's peer-reviewed articles, I don't know, 180 or something like that, but it includes conference presentations and all kinds of things like that.
Yes, so very active in this regards, right? In addition, you're founder and director from Humintell, yeah? Am I pronouncing this correctly? Yes. Humintell or Humintell? Humintell, okay.
Yes.
It's a research and training company that specializes on the science of reading people. We're going to come back to reading people in a moment, but also body language and nonverbal behavior. But for me, very interesting, of course, is also deception detection, right? But again, we will come back on this a little bit later. Now, if that all is not enough yet, you're also an 8th degree black belt in judo, right? And you were even admitted to the Hall of Fame of the United States Judo Federation. So quite an achievement. So are there any hours of the day when you have time to sleep?
Thomas, to tell you the truth, I love sleeping. I sleep a good 7 or 8 hours every day, and one of the best times of every day, I think.
Okay. But did I capture more or less the essentials?
No. Well, Thomas, you're very kind. Thank you very much for that. Yes, I'm still a professor of psychology at San Francisco State.
Okay.
I've been there for 32 years. I'm also the director of Humintell, where, as you mentioned, doing research and training on reading people and nonverbal behavior, emotion, all within the fields of deception detection, investigative interviewing, threat assessment, and social influence. And yes, I do a lot of judo, although getting older makes it a little bit more difficult, but I try to keep up with my workout schedule every day to try to keep some fitness going as well.
Okay. Now you mentioned age first. Yeah. May I ask how old you are?
I am 62 years old.
Okay. Very, very well appearance still. Very well. Okay.
Thank you. So it must be these filters that I have on my screen or something.
Yes. Hey, I have a couple of agenda points collected. Yeah, one of course is nonverbal communication. The second is deception detection, micro expressions. Yeah, in regards to nonverbal deception cues, micro expressions. Sorry, yeah, misconceptions about nonverbal deception cues. That's quite an interesting one. And if you have still time over, I would like to discuss a little bit linguistic deception markers, because I heard you speaking also about verbal deception. Okay.
Of course.
Now, if we start with nonverbal communication, yeah. So I've seen writings about nonverbal communication. I think it's at least going back to 900 BC, right? But who made it a little bit more common knowledge here in our Western world was Charles Darwin, of course. But in essence, from your perspective, what exactly is nonverbal communication?
Oh my God! Well, nonverbal communication is the transmittal of messages in any mode that is not the words. So it's very broad, to tell you the truth. And nonverbal communication, many scholars generally have placed them into 3 or 4 buckets, depending upon the scholar. Nonverbal communication occurs in the environment. Because it gives cues to us in terms of how we can behave and whatnot. Nonverbal communication occurs in our physical appearance, like what we have here. Nonverbal communication occurs in what I call behavioral traces. Like, for example, you've got those books behind you on a bookshelf with that particular art-like thing on the top, and that gives people who see that an impression of what your personality is like and what your preferences and things are like, or at least how you're trying to manage the impressions of people. Like I put this up, right? This also gives a message of some sort, rather than the mess that you, Thomas, saw before I put this on. So we call those behavioral traces. Mm-hmm. And then there's the nonverbal behavior. These are the dynamic behaviors, these emotions of my face, my hands, my voice, that occur most of the time when we're in interaction, but of course when we're alone. So there's those 4 buckets of nonverbal communication. They're very huge as well. And I focus on the nonverbal behavior bucket of that. Of course, there's a lot of other messages and many other scholars who do work in the other areas of nonverbal communication as well.
I think you answered my next question already. Can we ever not communicate, right? Because even if we freeze completely and say nothing, that in itself is already communication, right?
Oh, of course. And even when you're not there, you communicate things. So, for example, I mentioned your layout there, but there's actually research out there that demonstrates that people seeing a layout of an office or a living room or something like that will generally make not extremely accurate, but somewhat accurate judgments of the personalities of the people who laid out that area. And so, yes, you can get messages whether you are doing it or not, consciously or not.
Mm-hmm. And you just mentioned emotions, yeah. So, what's the relationship between emotions and nonverbal communication?
Well, first of all, in order to answer that, let me say a little bit about emotion, because emotion depends upon who you talk to, right? And as you've studied this area and you've got Darwin's book in front of you, most people who study emotions consider emotions as a very specific and special type of mental phenomenon, and that they are reactions to things that we evaluate or appraise that are important to us. And those evaluations are occurring unconsciously. But because these are reactions, they have certain type of profile in our minds, in our bodies, and they have different types of intrapersonal and interpersonal and social cultural functions. And what I'm trying to say is that they're different. Emotions are different than affect. Affect is the general feeling that we have, and we have affect almost all the time. But we don't have emotions all the time, because emotions are special. Emotions are quick reactions to certain things that essentially had something to do, we interpret it as having something to do with our survival, something that's really important to us. And for that reason, so if I want to separate, first I want to distinguish emotion from affect, because affect, although it does have some nonverbal signals that are associated with affect, emotions have much clearer signals nonverbally. And I'm sure I'm guessing that you're going to talk about how research has demonstrated that a small set of emotions have a certain universal signal set package in the face, in the voice, and in our whole bodies that are triggered, that are elicited once people have an emotion. And so going back to your question, the association between emotion and nonverbal behavior is huge, and it's very important. And that nonverbal behavior serves multiple functions, one of which it has meaning to others, right? So if I signal an emotion in myself, that'll have meaning to you about my internal state. It'll have meaning to you about what you think you might be doing next, et cetera, et cetera. So it has a communicative value. But emotions, my nonverbal behavior also has meaning to myself. So, for example, when you wrinkle your nose in disgust, not only is that telling you that I'm disgusted and I'm feeling yucky, but it's also helping me to close off my nasal passages here, so it cuts down a little bit on the smells of whatever I'm smelling to create that reaction. So, every nonverbal behavior has some kind of meaning, not only to the perceiver but also to myself, and that's true for all. That's true for these emotions, and that's why, going back to your question, emotions and nonverbal behavior have a very special relationship that's very important.
Yeah. And indeed, we're going to come back to the 7 universal emotions a little bit later, especially when we talk about microexpression. From deception detection perspective, and you notice, of course, that the more emotional, the higher the stakes, the easier it is actually to read them and the more difficult it is to hide them. Yeah. But that's not always the situation that we're in. We're sometimes in lower stakes situation where it's still important to figure out if someone is truthful or not. Yeah, that's why. That's why the question. Coming back to one of the statements on your website, reading people, right? So what does it mean for you? What's your definition of reading people?
Well, my definition of reading people is the ability to observe, and when I say observe, I also mean by hearing, but the ability to observe all of the signals, or as much of the signals that a person is providing, to get a greater sense of what that individual's personality, intentions, motivations, unconscious thoughts, feelings, et cetera, that go beyond the words. And that's what I refer. And essentially, reading people is reading nonverbal behavior and understanding nonverbal behavior, but putting it in addition to the words, because words are incredibly important. And there's often a misnomer about myself and my work that I don't think words are important. Words are extremely important. What our work and my work and many other scholars' work is trying to say is that everything is in context, and if we only focus on the words, we miss other messages in that context, and the nonverbal behavior is providing a lot of that other contextual context for the meanings of the word, or the meanings that are being given to us. And so, going back to your question, reading people, to me, refers to the ability to extract as much meaning as possible from the individual that go beyond the words.
I understand. So I'm specifically interested in the linguistic part, yeah. But again, we can do this a little bit later. But since you scratched it on already, yeah, non-verbal versus verbal communication, yeah. And I think I heard you saying the relative contribution of verbal and non-verbal cues, and that goes back to Albert Mehrabian. I hope I pronounce his name correctly. Where at the end, basically 93% of all communication is non-verbal, right? Now, this is a statement that comes in, I think, half of my books in the background in regards to nonverbal communication, or maybe 2/3 of them go in this direction. Yeah, but Albert Mehrabian himself on his website, he tries to diffuse this misconception that has penetrated everything. Yeah, professionals, police, trainers, even some scientists, right? So it's a very tricky situation so it's very challenging to refocus the interpretation between verbal communication and non-verbal communication, but also specifically in terms of deception detection, right?
Well, you're exactly right, and allow me to give my interpretation
Please.
of what Mehrabian was trying to say. I mean, specifically, that statement that is attributed to Mehrabian was made in relation to
Liking,
a situation in which, where the words and the nonverbal behaviors were inconsistent with each other. And when the words and the nonverbal behavior or the nonverbal communication is inconsistent with each other, not only his but other studies have shown that between 65 and 95% of the messages that are being perceived by individuals come from nonverbals. And so, but it's within that particular context. And so, explaining that, it gets a little bit tricky because you have to do it what I just said, and so thus people come up with the shortcuts about the most of the messages are most of the important messages are nonverbal, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. But if you think about the other side, when the words and the nonverbals are consistent, it kind of doesn't matter what's the relative contribution to begin with, right? Where we're interested in understanding what the relative contribution of the verbals words from the nonverbals is specifically in that inconsistent context anyway. And so to some degree, there's some degree of meaning that can be extracted from the simpler version of that phrase, I think.
Yeah, agree. Coming back to purely nonverbal communication, yeah. What are the key items that a trained observer, let's say it this way, can deduct by observing nonverbal behavior? I mean, we know social class, status, dominance, confidence, etc., but what else is there?
Well, I think I mentioned them on the fly when I was talking, but basically you get ideas of people's personalities in terms of their expressivity, in terms of how gregarious they are, how open they are, how shy they are, how reserved they are, how wary they are, whether they're happy-go-lucky or more of the another type of personality trait. So you see that in the nonverbals in terms of a general personality issue. Then when you're talking specific topics, you can get an idea of intent, motivation. I mean, essentially, nonverbal behavior has different types of functions, right? They can complement your words. They can supplement the words, they can qualify the words, or they can contradict the words. And once we have a framework like that to understand what's happening when we're reading people, that gives you the idea of you can take the words and in combination with the nonverbals and gain many, many different insights about individuals. Of course, then there's the other demographics like what people's cultures are, right? What their gender identities may be. If you're looking at people within a group, 2 or more people, you can get an idea of the status differences within there, how close or not people are to each other. So you can get all of that. I mean, all of those kinds of messages are being transmitted. We can capture that if we know what to look for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And can we get better in nonverbal communication? I mean, that's actually a bidirectional question. Yeah? Can we get better in nonverbal communication in sending, also coding? And can we get better in nonverbal communication in regards to receiving or decoding nonverbal cues from others? Now, I think we should separate this, yeah, because the sending and coding, the awareness, the self-consciousness, the mindfulness of managing, first of all, their own emotions, the underlying emotions, and then being able to, again, modify or control the signals that we're sending out, I think that's already a challenge in itself.
Oh, well, yes, let's stick with sending. It is an extremely hard challenge. I mean, first of all, let's start with the baseline that most people are pretty good at it. We don't go to classes on all of this kind of stuff. However, everything we learn about sending and receiving nonverbal behaviors on the job training in our everyday lives. And the nonverbal behavior is incredibly important for us for social coordination. And the fact of the matter is that if we're not coordinated with others, we won't survive. It's true, just as true today as it was in our evolutionary history. Happens in different ways now, but we need to coordinate socially, and the nonverbal behaviors help us do that social coordination. And so we learn how to do all of that to whatever degree that we do it through our lives. And so we're generally pretty good at it because humans are still here. If we weren't good at it, we wouldn't be around. Mm-hmm. And so we have to start with that basis that we're pretty good at it. Now, can we get better? As you mentioned, it's very tough because we're doing this, I don't want to say unconsciously, but it's in the background of our consciousness, clearly. And researchers demonstrated very clearly that most of us have no idea what we're doing nonverbally, right? Especially in our faces and in our gestures. Now, we may be a little bit more aware of it in this Zoom age or whatever, this platform that we're in now, but that's because we can see each other. But that doesn't mean that I knew I was going to do this right before I did it. I did not know that, and it just happened. Like this. This just happened. And so it's very difficult. However, I happen to be one of those that believe that nothing is impossible unless as long as you give it a shot and try as best as you can. And that's from my judo background or something like that. But especially today, with us wearing masks, I think, and we're not like this, of course, but if we're first face to face, it's obvious that wearing masks has cut down on our visual cues and our nonverbal and what we're reading nonverbally. And thus there's greater not conflict, not necessarily conflict, but questions about what people are thinking, what their intentions are. And thus I think there's a greater awareness in the last few months or half a year that we can do other nonverbal things like speak louder, use more gestures, nod more, or things like that. And so I think people became more conscious of that over the last year and a half or two of COVID. And so, yes, it can be done, but it's difficult. And it's difficult because humans have done it for the last 100,000 years or whatever theory you want to believe in without really thinking about it. So that's that. With regard to reading others, again, we're generally good at it. And in terms of general everyday social coordination, I think we are perfectly fine. The question is whether there are some people that want to get better. And here, clearly, if we put effort into getting better, we can clearly get better. However, one has to, because nonverbal reading skills are trainable. And it's clear that even though we have a good baseline to start with, once you get trained, you get better at it. You get better at identifying what the signals mean in terms of their message value, their signal value. So there's no question about that. The important thing is, number one, does a person want to learn, right? And number two, what are they learning? And with regard to that, you can just look online in whatever search engine of your choice is and find out how to read people. And there's tons of people telling you how to do that. Yeah. I happen to focus a lot of my research work is on validating what kind of behaviors mean, what their signal values are. And then my training work focuses on training people on the validated signals. Because there's a lot of stuff out there in the world about nonverbal behavior, and much of it is either not unvalidated or not validated. Yeah. And that's a big distinction, I think. If you train people on unvalidated or non-validated signals, they won't get better. Yeah. In fact, it can get worse. However, if you train people on validated signal and validated nonverbal behavior, it's very clear people get better. And if you then learn how to apply that in your work, then you become more effective. Yeah. So I think the the opportunities for learning to read people are a lot greater than the opportunity to monitor and regulate your own behavior, although that's not impossible either.
Especially when the emotions and the stakes are higher, it gets more and more difficult. And if you consider that we have multiple communication channels that we have to monitor from ourselves and from others at the same time, so it's quite a challenging task. In regards to misconception, I have prepared something later. I will pick this up when we come to this topic. In regards to, if we switch now more specifically to deception detection, an intro question might be, can you detect deception with nonverbal communication? What's your point on this one?
Yeah.
View on this one?
Well, listen, to tell you the truth, my short answer is no. In fact, my short answer for verbal words are also no. Because, and I don't mean that, let me qualify that, okay? Because nonverbal behavior can be great tools to detecting deception, as can words and linguistic features of linguistic features can also do that. But I believe that there are tools to do that. I don't believe in that you see this and thus, that means that it's deceptive. Yeah. Or you hear that in the words, you mean that that's deceptive. And I think that's the misnomer. And it's kind of related to the earlier comment about the Moravian's statement as well. Why do these misnomers exist, right? Why do these myths exist? And to tell you the truth, I think it comes down to the fact that people love short, easy, fast things. Yeah. And it's around us, all around us in the world. When in fact, the skill of detecting deception is not just observational, whether it's seeing or hearing, but it's being able to process what you're seeing and hearing and engaging in the conversation well based upon leveraging what you're seeing and hearing that leads the conversation to uncovering deception. And so I think that's where the nonverbal behavior and linguistic indicators of deception are. I think that's where their value is. Yeah. And I think that's when we train people, and that when we study it and when we train it, this is what we see.
Okay, agree. Multi-channel, verbal, non-verbal, it has to be combined, context, etc., etc. If you would have to define, if you have to make the separation or define a lie versus a deception, how would you define this?
Actually, I don't differentiate between them. I define.
As a researcher,
have to define them both. As a researcher, I don't differentiate them. I believe lies and deceit are essentially the same thing as a mental construct. They are deliberate acts to mislead or give others a different impression than one knows. And they do it deliberately. Okay. I think that both of them, to me, both of them are lies and deception.
Okay. I'm asking specifically. I mean, again, my interest is from the corporate perspective and specifically during negotiations. Yeah. And what I've seen in my own research is that managers and negotiators with decades-long experience, and probably also not so experienced ones, they actually avoid outright lies. But they do use deceptive strategies, right? Because they're less risky, you have plausible deniability, etc., etc. That's why I'm asking.
Well, what is it? So what is the difference between that in your mind there?
Well, okay. When I started being interested in emotional intelligence about 10, 12 years ago. Yeah? And to my big surprise then, being a bit naive, I thought, there is a universal scientific agreement on what is intelligence. Yeah. Now, you know it yourself. You have hundreds of research papers arguing one way or the other. Now, a definition of a lie and deception is a similar situation, right? There are multiple definitions for that. Yeah. But in an outright lie, it's presenting something that is by definition not true. Yeah, but you could be deceptive, for example, even by speaking the literal truth, right? But so that's the main difference here, and this is where
I see. Yeah. So one way I understand what you're saying is a difference between lies of omission and lies of commission. So lies of commission would be fabrication, right? I'm telling you something that's obviously not true. Lies of omission is I'm telling you everything that's true. I'm just leaving out what I want to lie about, right? In our work, both in research and training, we put them together because I want to know what the indicators are for both of those, whatever we call them. And it's true, the indicators are different. However, I go back to my earlier statement. Once you have an indicator anyway, whether it's linguistic or nonverbal, I'm going to come back to you in the conversation, and I'm going to flesh that out a little bit more. So that's how I understand the difference there.
Yeah. So since you mentioned omissions, and that's exactly what my research was about. Deceptive omissions in high-stakes negotiations. So when we talk about omissions, and technically you're not lying, the advantage that the deceiver has, of course, is there may be not this emotional investment. The stakes are less because actually technically it's not a lie. The liar may not even feel that he does something wrong. That means all the nonverbal signals that come with emotions are basically not there, right? So it's a special tricky situation for anyone trying to decode that behavior. So I would be very much interested in your view exactly in this scenario, right? You have a situation where we're in a high stakes negotiation and someone just leaves some important parts out, right? No emotional engagement, there is no deception in the technical sense, there's plausible deniability, etc., etc. So what would you look for in such a situation?
Oh, well, to tell you the truth, there are indicators of when people are. So I'm sorry. When people do lies of omission, basically they're telling. I'm going to go along the timeline. There's a truth, skip, truth, right? And to tell you the truth, there are indicators at these times. And so what we examine are what are those kinds of indicators, and the indicators are both verbal and nonverbal. And so we can identify those indicators. If we identify those kinds of indicators, now I'm going to come back and talk to you more about what's going on over here, because at some point, and all lie detection is like this for us, at some point when we come back with the indicators, stories will not make sense, and you will know it and I will know it. And so in the end, deception is only known once we uncover that verbally. The indicators lead us to the conversation that allow us to have that conversation. But the omission indicators are occurring at these particular times as well as throughout the others. And so when you examine lies of fabrication where people just tell you something that's totally false, and lies of omission, the indicators are there. Maybe there's some relative degrees of differences in the types of indicators here and there, but the set of indicators that we're examining are always the same. And we always then tactically go back to where in the statement that you're giving me, I'm going to go based upon what indicators I see and where I saw it in the during the time.
You have examples?
I hope
you have examples of those indicators?
Sure. Now you're asking me some trade secret issues, and I don't know if I want to talk about them in an open forum like this. Okay. But yeah. Anyway, so let's say yes, I have the examples. Okay. I'm not sure whether I'm going to talk about them too much right now, but they're indicators here. I mean, it's clear.
Yeah. Okay. So from a verbal perspective, and I'm not shy to talk about them, there are clear signs for text bridges, like Dr. Jack Schaefer calls them. Yeah.
Schaefer calls them text bridges. Yeah. Great. And so you know Schaefer's work. So Schaefer used certain types of adverbs here and there. Yeah. That identified them. Yeah. We found that those kinds of adverbs occur with other kinds of adverbs across different languages, and they occur with certain types of nonverbal behaviors.
Yeah.
So those text bridges are the example of those. Whereas fabrication indicators, you would get text bridges with text bridge adverbs with fabrications as well as nonverbal behaviors in fabrications as well.
Yeah. So, but these are verbal indicators, right? Give me an idea in which direction you would look for nonverbal indicators. I mean, you don't have to spell your whole trade secret, but give me an indication in which direction to look for.
Well, for example, one of the times that you would do the text bridge, oftentimes people are going to be providing a statement. Let me step back. When people are talking, we have what's called a total communication package. Mm-hmm. The total communication package includes the words and the flow and the and my demeanor that's occurring with that. That's the entire package that's coming at us. Let's just say that the package can look different at the text bridges. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, this package will look different at the text bridges. And by the way, here's another definitional issue. You call them, yes, they're words, but they're different than content, right? And so we separate those kinds of verbal activity from the content of the words. So there's people and researchers and operators who focus more on content of words. Like who examine consistency in statements, who examine for contradictions in statements. So then people are looking for content kind of indicators. Mm-hmm. What you're talking about there with the text bridges are what I would call linguistic and grammatical features of speech. Mm-hmm. And so we also differentiate that aspect of the verbal world as well.
I guess you're familiar with Pennebaker's work, The Secret Life of Pronouns, function words.
Oh yeah, of course. Oh yeah, of course.
Great work in that sense. Problem there is for manual analysis not very suitable. You really need AI kind of programs to help you with it. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, that's a very interesting thought, because you can take Pennebaker's like Luke, linguistic inquiry for word count. Yeah. In case your viewers may not be familiar with that, which takes the words in a statement, counts them up, categorizes them to their various functions and categories. And using that alone, it's very difficult to differentiate true statements from false statements. Yeah. So that's where I go back. Even though some of that is very, very indicative of deception and veracity, it comes back to a person who's hearing it and is able to process it. If you want to do this well, you don't want to just have what I call surface assessment. Yeah. And that's true for nonverbals as well. I wouldn't take, you did a micro expression, thus you're lying. I wouldn't do that either. I think that the surface assessments are the start of a process in my mind to then go and figure out how whether the deception is occurring or not. Yeah.
There's one particular part that I found really interesting from Pennebaker's work. Yeah, so he makes this division between function words and content words. Content words, table, computer, Thomas, sky, whatever. Function words, articles, pronouns, auxiliary words, etc., etc. Now, rule of thumb: let's say the average English native speaker has about a vocabulary of 100,000 words readily available. Usage is 8 to 10,000 words, but of those 100,000 words, only 450 function words exist. That's 0.5%. However, and this is where it gets interesting, those function words are used 55% of the time. So again, 0.5% of all the words are being used 55% of the time. But the difference between those function words and content words is that the function words are actually processed in a different part of the brain. Yeah, that means that the ability to consciously control those function words, either by me speaking or by you listening, would increase the cognitive load on my end to such a degree that I would no longer be able to coherently talk, and you would not be able to coherently listen to what I'm actually saying. Yeah, which is why those function words are really, really interesting for deception detection. But again, you would need some technological assistance in terms. But I have a nice example later on that one. Okay.
Well, your point is exactly right, and it's related to nonverbal behavior and emotions as well. And so, because we're not always regulating that at all, or as well as we could/should. And of course, the other big variable in all of this is who's asking the questions, right? Mm-hmm. And what's the topic of the negotiation, and what's the stakes of being found out? And I find that if one is a skilled question maker, that trumps almost everything. Because if you're a skilled question maker and you can then read the nonverbals or the function words or other things and leverage them. Now we're talking about somebody who can uncover deception much better than anybody else.
Yes. You said something absolutely fundamental, and coincidentally, this is a big part of my own study. Yeah. Again, very experienced negotiators, they don't listen. They don't really listen what is being said. Yeah. So the deceptive, we had quite an elaborate setup, yeah. But the deceptive speakers succeeded in more than 80%, only because the other one was not listening to the answers of his or her own questions. Yeah.
Okay.
Briefly continuing, I have a little cheat sheet here next to me. I would like to cover some questions. There are many books where it's described that lies are everywhere. We lie all the time. You know, like I have seen anything from 20 to 80 or 90 or 100 lies per day. I don't want to go into discussion now. What is a lie? Because white lies we know, social lies we know. What I'm interested in are basically lies that matter, where there's an impact, right? So from your perspective, from your research, what type of lies have you found to be, I can't say the preferred ones, but the most utilized ones, if that makes any sense?
Oh, it's lies of omission.
Omission, okay.
Lies of omission.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, there's no question about
it.
Oh, yeah, there's no question about it. I don't know. I've never done a count of it, but it's clear that lies of omission are the vast majority of most of the lies that we see.
Yeah. So that's one of the gaps that I see between empirical science and, how shall I say, popular science and writers about trainings and lie to me and spot the lies in 3 seconds or whatever. Yeah, where it's clear that. So overwhelming evidence is exactly what you said. The preferred means of deception is actually omission, not lying. So if there is no lie, how do you detect the lie in that sense? Yeah.
Well, again, so that we have a definition of difference in that, right? Yeah. Because I do believe that because I'm a psychologist, right? I'm in the mental states of the individual, and for the mental state of the individual is, you're exactly right. They know they're telling the truth to a certain point, but the fact that they're omitting means that they also know that they're lying. And once you do that, your mind goes into not overdrive, or it could be overdrive, but your mind is doing different things because, number one, you have to think about your lie, and then you know that you have to lie about your thinking, right? And then you're having emotions about the fact that you're lying, and you have lying about the fact that you have emotions. And so because of all of these various processes that are going on, even when people are omitting, you get signals. So anyway, that's why I think even with people who are omitting, I know you mentioned that they think they're telling the truth, and I think you're exactly right about it at a certain point. But they also know that they're lying, right? By omitting, and so thus it creates this mental fugue that goes on.
Yeah.
And nonverbal behavior and linguistic and grammatical features of speech are I had the word about it, but they're the signs of that process, essentially.
Signals, popular, so everywhere in the science, what I've read so far, there's universal agreement. If we come now to deception, sorry. The other way around, right?
Yeah.
There's universal agreement that basically we all are no better than flipping a coin when it comes to deception detection, right? It's about technically 54%. That includes any professionals whatsoever. I have seen a study where surprisingly, the best deception detectors actually were teachers. Yeah. Teachers, social workers, and criminals on place 3. Yeah, everything else, also police officers, detectives, custom officers, general public, students, federal officers, police officers, judges, they are below this 55% area, right? So, do you think that more experience, and I'm talking about negotiator experience, police experience, these kind of things, yeah? Do you think that more experience on the job makes you better in deception detection?
In general, yes, but very generally, I think because I see a lot of people who have a lot of experience and are just awful.
Yeah.
And so I would say in general, yes, but with a large degree of individual variation. And when I say in general, yes, it's because people who are, if you're doing something in a profession that requires that where deception detection on some level is required to be effective, and there's accountability for you in that profession, generally you're going to get better. Because if you're not, you should be fired, right? Again, if there's accountability in the profession, or you change jobs or something like that. And so oftentimes there's accountability of some sort. And so I would say, yeah, probably. But I think there's a huge range of variation around there where people get entrenched in thinking they're good, and then they're really not good. On the other hand, there's people who are really good, but they don't know why they're good, right? And so there's that huge range of experience that occurs. And one of the things about going back to training on validated indicators is we can, for the people who are not good at all, to tell you the truth, we can get them on the right. It's oftentimes because they're queuing on unvalidated or non-validated things. For the people who are good at what they're doing, we give them mental buckets that make them process more efficiently. And so, but going back to your question, yeah, I think experience probably has a positive, a low, high, positive correlation, something like that, with a large degree of individual variation.
I think, specifically for police or law enforcement, the ground truth is always the problem. There's very seldom direct impact to verify direct feedback.
Sure. I think you're exactly right. However, and with the police, the vast majority of them want to do the right thing, and the vast majority of them who stay in the job are very good, and the vast majority of them have a theory about what it is, and oftentimes, in my experience, sometimes the theory is spot on with validated science, and sometimes it's not. But they're good anyway, and so it's kind of weird how that works.
Yeah, I agree. The next topic that I would like to discuss is some misconception in regards to deception cues. We can, for example, start with a very easy one. I just threw it out there. So many people think that the longer you know somebody, the better you are able to spot detection. What's your view on this?
Well, yeah, I think that's. I'm trying to think about what the research says about that. I'm not familiar with research on it.
I give you a keyword.
However,
keyword: truth bias.
Yeah. Okay. There you go. So it's absolutely, because we get into a lull about wanting to believe people that we know, right?
Exactly.
And so because we get into that confirmation bias about trying to confirm our minds. And so I absolutely think that exists.
Yeah. Okay. So I put out a study that I found during my own study. It's the Global Deception Research Team. Have you heard about them?
Oh yeah. It's led by Charlie Bond.
Yeah. So they did a study in 75 different countries in 43 different languages, and I have actually the table in front of me, so I have not memorized this all. But they looked at the most common deception indicators that untrained people believe to be associated with deception, right? Now, I have the list, the top 10 I have in front of me, and I would briefly like to discuss some of them, So, for example, eye contact, almost more than 70% of all the populations in the 75 different countries do believe that breaking eye contact is a sign of someone lying, right?
Yep.
Now, tell us the truth here.
Oh, well, a lot of studies have actually tested that hypothesis, and the vast majority of them don't support that hypothesis. In fact, but we do know that averting one's eyes is a sign of mental searching, right? So we're searching for an answer, but it's not necessarily fabricating an answer. And so the vast majority of studies don't support that hypothesis. In fact, there's actually research in the last few years that demonstrate that even liars know that, and so liars will have a greater tendency to look you in the eye when they're lying.
Yes, exactly.
Of course, that's a little difficult in Zoom because I'm trying to look at the camera and I can't see you. So it's kind of interesting how this might be playing off in this video world here.
Yes. The next one is shifting posture. It's almost, again, it's the second one. It's almost 70%. People believe that shifting posture is a sign of deception. Your view.
Right.
Your view.
Again, that fidgeting and other things that are that may be thought of as nervous movement. People tell the truth can be are often very nervous because there's stakes for them as well. They want to be believed, and they can be afraid that they're not being believed.
Exactly.
And sometimes, depending upon the topic, if you're asking them something that requires a lot of cognition, having high cognitive questions also makes people move and do things and look away and blink and all kinds of things like that. And so, yes, there's a lot of research that demonstrates that some of that can be indicative of the discriminability. Let's call it a discriminability index for various indicators, goes down with things like fidgeting and moving around and shifting and things like that.
Exactly. The next one is self-touch. Also, almost 70% people believe that if someone is lying, is touching, comforting, these kind of things, hand movements, etc., etc. Where we know that actually from research we know that actually the movements are decreasing. Stories are believed to be longer if someone is lying. Now here I have to say what I found from looking at research papers. Two different directions. Some research indicated they are indeed longer because they need more details to fabricate. Others say they are shorter because the deceiver, they want to give too much details which they would have to remember, etc., etc. So again, that's not a clear one for me. Stuttering is about 60%. We can debate this. Pauses. Speech pauses. I have also seen different results in researches, some in different directions. Liars are supposed to be more nervous. That's a tricky one. Exactly Othello's error. Exactly what you just described. You can be nervous for both reasons, because you're not believed, because you speak the truth, or because you're lying. Hand gestures, 60, almost 60%. We know hand gestures goes down, etc., etc. But what's not on this list, that's what I wanted to ask you, are eye blinks, right? So very often eye blinks are associated with lies. However, and we have to make a distinction here, and I would like to have your point of view. I know from research that when we are under cognitive load, eye blinks actually decrease, almost to a standstill. But after the cognitive load is resolved, we have a compensatory period where we indeed blink. But then, coming back to deception detection, under nervousness, if I believe certain research, we also blink. Now, from deception detection perspective, this makes it very tricky, because if you're nervous, you blink. Under cognitive load, so how can I, how to identify these two different scenarios is very tricky.
Well, so what our approach to that is that we want to, so first of all, before all of this, one important variable that undergirds everything that we just talked about is individual differences, right? Some people are just more nervous. Some people stutter. Some people are more fidgety. Some people are not, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of the research the research findings sometimes confounds what people are like to begin with. And it doesn't take that into account. So that's one thing to think about. But with regard to the blink rates, you're exactly right. They can go higher with certain things and lower with certain things, both of which can be meaningful. Thus, which one you're going to look for? What we look for, what our perspective is what do people usually do when they're just talking? Because people have a normal, what's called a baseline, right? And we want to know what the baseline is. The question then is, for things like blink rates, what we're examining is deviations from the baseline. They can be higher or lower, or whatever, wherever they're going to go. The deviations are meaningful, but they're meaningful for changes in cognitive load, not necessarily for fabrication or lying or deception or anything like that. So again, once I see the blink rate changing, now I'm thinking, okay, they're thinking more, thinking less, or whatever that is. But that's all I know. What I want to know is, what I need to do then is triage whether that's on topic that's relevant for me or not, and then come back to that with my expert questioning of some sort, so I can ferret that out. But that's how we would approach something like that.
Before we continue, I have a quick question in between. Do you have a hard stop in 10 minutes, or do you have a couple?
It would be good about 10 or so. That would be great.
Okay. Then I skip a question that I had in between about baselining.
Okay.
And come to what specific.
Sorry.
No problem. Specifically to deception detection, what type of training does your company provide?
Well, we train people we do a lot of training for national security, law enforcement, intelligence, and whatnot for the, for the federal government and for state and local police. We also do training for certain private companies. A lot of them are involved in negotiations. Our training can encompass both verbal and nonverbal aspects of behavior of the total communication package. Within both, whether it's verbal or nonverbal, our training focuses on validated indicators, what we call the behaviors that have been shown to lead to the differentiation of deception versus veracity. Depending upon the training, it can include things like you talked about, the text bridges, and that is encompassed within our what we call statement analysis and what many people call statement analysis. We happen to focus on, within that realm, we focus on the linguistic and grammatical features of speech that our research, which I think is the only research, has shown that there's certain linguistic and grammatical features that are similarly used across different languages, which is kind of an interesting thing, right? It goes back to what you're talking about for mental processing. With the nonverbals, again, it all depends upon the length of the training. We train on facial expressions. And with expressions, there's facial expressions of emotion. There's blink rates, like you're talking about, facial signs of cognition. Then there's gestures, all of this stuff. We train on the voice and various things. We have a priority order by which we all do that is based upon our science that has demonstrated what are the priority orders in training, all of that. Taking a long way to say that. So we do a lot of that kind of training for those individuals. We don't train. My company does not train certain types of law firms. Gamblers. Or the dating world. We don't dabble in any of that.
Understand. Hey, you said statement analysis. Is that from Mark McLeish? Is that what you're referring to?
Well, no, he's got his own thing that he developed. I mean, statement analysis is actually an umbrella term for this whole area of using linguistic and grammatical features of speech. Probably started with Deutsch. Back in the 50s and whatnot. John Yule in Canada has a great program called CBCA, content-based criteria, right? Or
criteria-based content analysis.
McLeish has his own thing going on. You mentioned Schaefer. Schaefer had his own thing going on. Our company focuses on what has been empirically validated, not only by us but others as well. And we focus only on those linguistic and grammatical features of speech.
Okay. Last question before we come to microexpressions. Did you do any your own research in regards to deception during negotiations?
Well, yes and no. It depends upon how you define the negotiation. Because I think an interview about whether you committed a crime is a negotiation.
True.
And so yes, within that context. And we've done research in other non-investigative contexts as well. So I happen to believe a lot of that is negotiation. And thus the answer would be yes. Now, if you talk about specific types of negotiation, probably not. So it comes back to our definitions of negotiation and the purpose of the interaction.
Okay. Now, again, my question to you would be, how far can you go with microexpression? Maybe that's the best.
Well, again, all indicators, whether they're verbal or nonverbal, are the signs to then dig further. And that's true for microexpressions as well. However, within the vast array of possible indicators that exist, in terms of relative importance, I would put microexpressions at the top of the list. Because they're always signs of something concealed. Now, people can conceal things that are not relevant to whatever you're talking about, and that's where the ambiguity becomes. What you mentioned, whether things are congruent or not with context or communication, that can be true for micros as well as macros. And so that's a diagnostic way of thinking about it, regardless of what you're seeing. With micros, however, micros are very special because they're always signs that someone's concealing something in their mind. And if you're interested in possible deception, you want to figure that out. And for that reason, micros are in a different category, I think, than everything else.
Okay.
That being said, I know we're running out of time, but I got to go back to your first question. I would not say, "Oh, I saw a micro, thus that person's lying." I don't do that.
Yeah.
It always comes back to what the purpose of the conversation is, and me using that as a guide to come back to our conversation and ask questions or engage with you a little better. I always think that that's always a better process. And the other thing about it is, although our course I think is pretty good, people need to have context. So like when you engage with a course like that, you can place it into where you would use it and where you would not use it, et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes we get people who engage with it and they'll say something like, "Well, okay, I can read them. So what?" And so there's unless people have the context in their mind and a framework with what they would do with it, it's hard to understand what you do with a new skill, essentially, like any skill. And so part of a better training, I think, is always getting that framework within which you can understand that as well.
Yeah. Okay. Those are I think very suitable concluding remarks. Thank you very much for your time. Please stay on for a moment, okay? Thank you.